for Common Cause Indiana, and I want to welcome you to our annual Good Government Seminar. We've been holding this event for over a decade, and it has become something we really look forward to. Our usual custom is to gather at the State House and have lunch together while listening to an esteemed panel of experts who provide us with lots of fodder for a lively question and answer session at the end. Obviously, the pandemic has forced us to change our format. And while I would really prefer to be in the same room with all of you, virtual events do have their benefits. For example, our audience this morning includes people from all over the state, much more so than when we held these in-person seminars. The virtual nature of our event also changes the way that we need to take attendance for the attorneys who are participating today. If you are an attorney who will be claiming the CLE credits that are available for this seminar, again, we have been certified for 1.9 general and ethics credits. You will need to enter your name and attorney in the question box at the end of the seminar. If you're not familiar with Zoom, which we all probably are very familiar at this point in the year, but if you hover down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. So again, at the end of the seminar, not before, but at the end, after the Q&A session, I need you to enter your name and your attorney number. We will take a screenshot of that information. I'll put it all together and get it into the CLE Commission in a week or so. So again, at the end of the seminar, in the Q&A box, I will need your name and your attorney number. If you have any questions about your CLE credits, please feel free to contact me via email at jvaughn@commoncause.org. So I am now going to turn the program over to our moderator. Jim Perrin is a member of the Common Cause Indiana Board and is a former 4-term mayor of Elkhart, Indiana. When he was elected to office, Jim was the youngest mayor in Indiana, which is a distinction that he shared with my father, who back in the 1960s, when he was elected mayor of Madison, Indiana, he was the youngest mayor in the state at that time as well. So I know that Jim, like my dad, brought a lot of energy and new ideas to the City Hall, and he has done the same on the Common Cause Indiana Board. Always somebody we can count on to ask good questions, to come up with good ideas. And so thanks a lot for serving as our moderator today, Jim. I'm going to turn the program over to you.
Well, Julie, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel, 2 of whom are old friends of mine, and it's great to see them again. I haven't seen them for a long time, both Joe Long-Thompson and Ed Fagenbaum, and a new friend to me, but certainly a longtime friend to Common Cause, and that's Steve Spalding. As Julia mentioned, just to I'll emphasize, we'll begin to take questions and answers at about 1 o'clock. But if each panelist will make their presentation, and we'll take the questions after each panelist has spoken, starting about 1 o'clock. So if you could enter your questions as you have them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, that would be very, very helpful. First, I'm pleased to introduce former Congressperson Joe Long-Thompson. Joe was elected to the Congress in 1989 and represented the Northeast in Indiana for 3 terms. In 1995, President Clinton nominated her to serve as Undersecretary of Agriculture and Rural Development, and President Obama appointed her to the Farm Credit Association as board chair and CEO, where she served until 2015. She is the author of The Character of American Democracy. Ed Fagenbaum is the founder of InGroup, a firm providing key information resources related to Indiana state politics and government. InGroup became part of Hannah News Service in 2018, with Ed leading the publishing activities. He has directed numerous projects for the Department of Justice and the Federal Election Commission, and is a nationally recognized expert on ethics, campaign finance, and election laws. Steve Spalding leverages his experience in government and the nonprofit sector to advance Common Cause's mission of open, honest, and accountable government that works in the public interest. Before returning to Common Cause, he most recently served as the Senior Elections Counsel to the Committee on House Administration in the U.S. House of Representatives. As senior aide to the chairperson, Representative Zoe Lofgren, he advised her and all committee members on all matters of election law. Steve plays a key role in the passage of H.R. 1, the For the People Act. So welcome all panelists, and our first speaker will be Congressman Long. Joe?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Julia, and Ed and Stephen. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of this program and have this opportunity. I'm going to focus my presentation on the importance of ethics to democracy. And whenever I talk about ethics and democracy, I'm taken back to an earlier time in my life. In the summer of 1974, after completing my undergraduate studies at Valparaiso University, I was working as an admissions counselor there, and my then congressman became relatively famous for something that he said during the Watergate hearings, and I quote, "Don't confuse me with the facts. I've got a closed mind. I will not vote for impeachment. I'm going to stick with my president, even if he and I have to be taken out of this building and shot." I was reminded of those remarks earlier this year when a congressman from North Carolina said about the president and morality, "The president, quote, has not led the most moral life, but it's not necessarily the moral content that makes a good leader." And he went on to say that leadership is about getting us, quote, from point A to point B. These statements, made almost 50 years apart by leaders in high office, reflect a serious misunderstanding of and an attitude that is inconsistent with the fundamentals of democracy. We don't often think about this. I think most of us at least don't, but democracy itself is an ethical concept. And a democratic government is both ethics and character-based, and that means the process by which we adopt policy is as important as the policy that we adopt. For democracy to work, the process of governing must be fair, it has to be equitable, transparent, and there must be protections of individual rights and freedoms. There also must be justice. Ethics are integral to democracy, and unethical leaders or even an unethical citizenry can undermine our democracy. As you know, the term democracy comes from Greece, the word meaning the people and power, in other words, power of the people. And so we have to make sure in our processes that we are respecting that power of the people and not elevating the power of some people in terms of the democratic process above others. Those of us who are fortunate enough to live in a democracy, we are the caretakers of democracy. But we often have to remind ourselves, because we like getting our way, that democracy is not about me getting my way or you getting your way. That's not victory in democracy. It's actually about all of us finding our way forward together. British philosopher John Stuart Mill argued that giving political power to the masses requires those in decision-making or leadership positions to consider the varied interests of all, which then leads to more balanced policymaking. And I like to always remind myself that research continues to show that diversity among decision-making teams leads to better decisions, and that is true in government as well as in business. The word character also has a Greek origin, and I find it very interesting how we now use the term character, but it's been used to denote a marking or an imprint on a coin. And coins, of course, are a form of currency. and different markings reflect different monetary values. I like to think that just as a coin's imprint reflects its value in the marketplace, a person's imprint on society determines the value that he or she or they add to or subtract from our world. Aristotle believed in excellences of character, meaning a combination of qualities that make an individual ethically admirable. What does this have to do with us in the United States? Why are ethics laws important? What is America's character? I actually believe that the answer to the question about America's character lies in the values that were set forth by our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That should be all people, but it was written at a much earlier time. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and their happiness. At the risk of sounding a little bit nerdy, I'm going to share with you that I think the preamble to the Constitution may be the greatest mission statement ever written. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Both of these documents clarify why ethical standards are important. And I have found over the years that that many people get uncomfortable talking about ethics because they think they are morality, and we have a right to choose our own moral values. Many people associate them with religion, and we have freedom of religion here in our country. But ethics are not religion or morality. And the definition that I have found that I like the best, and I think works very well for professional work, both in business as well as in the government, is the following: well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, or specific virtues. And interestingly, as you go around the world, when you ask people what they think the pillars of character are, and this now I want to move into talking about character and ethics, you find consistency regardless of where people live, regardless of the form of government that they live under or are a part of. Those pillars of character are trustworthiness, respect, responsibility, fairness, caring, and citizenship. And if you break those down, they relate very well to the values of democracy: trustworthiness, integrity. We have to have a process that has integrity, and that requires, for example, transparency in government, which is why we have the Freedom of Information Act and other laws on the books that protect transparency in government. Respect, and this is respect for others. We have to respect others and their rights and recognize that their rights are no less than our rights, and that we have to work together. And if we are not transparent, if we are not protecting others' rights and showing respect for them, then we're not upholding democratic values. Responsibility. We all have a responsibility to our government here because we are the caretakers. And those responsibilities include integrity and participation and a dedication to knowing what's going on and allowing us to make good decisions. Fairness, equity, there has to be equity or you simply don't have democracy. Caring for others, I think that is in many ways reflected in respect, but in democracy, we do have to care what happens to our fellow people, not just because it is the right thing to do from a virtue standpoint, but because it makes us stronger. It contributes to national security. When we're all educated, when we're all well-fed, when we are all employed, that works for us and helps us to protect this democratic government, this democratic society. And then good citizenship. And I think that also encompasses the previous 5, but we have responsibilities as citizens, and that citizenship includes being knowledgeable, being honest, being a participant. So when we look at the federal government, I'm going to break down between the legislative, executive, and the judicial branches, and just highlight some of the laws that are on the books that are very important to making sure that democracy works. Before I do that, I want to share a story with you from many years ago when I was in Congress, and I was walking home from the Capitol, not actually home because that would have been to Indiana, but I was walking to the little rental apartment that I rented on Capitol Hill. And it had been kind of a long day, and I ran into a very powerful committee chairman who was standing in front of a very expensive restaurant. And we talked, and then he said, well, Jill, why don't you join us upstairs for dinner? And I hesitated because I knew this was going to be in a private dining room and lobbyists would be paying for the meals, which was perfectly legal at that time. But I had a policy of not accepting even a cup of coffee or a Diet Coke from a lobbyist. And I hesitated, but then I said, well, sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I joined the group, but I didn't eat anything, and I just ordered a Diet Coke. And as I was sitting there, the wife of one of my good friends in Congress, who was sitting across the table from me, asked me why I wasn't eating. And I said, well, I'm not really very hungry, but I also don't accept meals from members of Congress. And she said, well, if we didn't come to these dinners, we could never eat in a fine restaurant like this. We don't have that kind of money. And my thought was, that's exactly why you shouldn't be here. Just to clarify, the next day I asked one of my staffers, I gave him it was $2 at the time, would buy a Diet Coke. And I asked him to take it to one of the lobbyists who was at that dinner and pay for my Diet Coke. But I knew that none of the people in that room thought they could be influenced by a fine dinner. They thought they were very objective. But I had come across a study when I was at Indiana University working on my doctorate that had been conducted at Yale that showed that you could be influenced, your opinion could be influenced by peanuts and Pepsi. In this study, there was an experimental group and a control group. And everybody in both groups had no opinion on a topic. Both groups were given the same promotional material to read, but those in the experimental group had access to peanuts and Pepsi while they were reading, and in a statistically significant amount, they agreed to a greater degree, if you will, with the promotional material, and their opinion changed as throughout that process. Now, you couldn't conclusively determine cause and effect, but the airlines certainly think that peanuts and Pepsi may put you in a better mood, or you wouldn't get peanuts and Pepsi on when you fly economy class. So if peanuts and Pepsi can influence you, certainly a meal in a fine restaurant can influence you. And unless you are not very appreciative, I think it's hard not to want to do something nice for somebody who did something nice for you. So if they take you to dinner, well, you want to be helpful, even if that's not in the best interest of your constituents or your country. And we need to make sure that we are as objective as we can be when we hold leadership positions and are representing the people who put us in those positions. Today, it would be illegal. I had introduced legislation to make the acceptance of gifts from lobbyists and others even illegal. My bill didn't become law, but some of the provisions of my bill did. A couple of highlights regarding members of the legislative branch. Members may not accept any gift from a registered lobbyist or an agent or an entity that retains or employs such individuals. conflicts of interest and exploitation. Members and staff may not use their official position or their access to non-public information for personal gain. And doing so puts their personal interests above the public's interest. So those are a couple of major broad provisions for the legislative branch. The executive branch is governed by a number of laws. I always like to talk about the 14 principles of ethics for the executive branch. And I want to go back and talk just briefly about the origin of these 14 principles. When President George Herbert Walker Bush took office in 1989, one of the issues that he wanted to address immediately was ethics in the executive branch. There had been a number of issues throughout the 1980s that made us question the ethicality of how the executive branch was conducting business. So he appointed a commission right after taking office, and this commission, it was an ethics commission, and they made recommendations to him on how we could improve the ethics in the federal executive branch. And it included these 14 principles, and then he issued an executive order within a couple of months of taking office. George Herbert Walker Bush was one of my heroes, such a courageous and honorable man. I'm not going to go through all 14 of them, but I do want to highlight several of them. Public service is a public trust requiring employees to place loyalty to the Constitution, the laws, and ethical principles above private gain. That's the very first one, and I think sets the stage well for others. Number 2, employees shall not hold financial interests that conflict with the conscientious performance of duty. And I have an example from my own life on this, and I will tell you I have a wonderful husband who resolved this potential conflict for me. When I was appointed by President Obama to serve as on the board of the Farm Credit Administration, and ultimately he then appointed me to be the board chair and CEO. The Farm Credit Administration is a prudential regulator, not unlike the Securities and Exchange Commission or the National Credit Union Administration, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency. And it is an arm's length regulator. And I was asked when doing my initial paperwork if I had any loans from the system, the lending institutions that we would be regulating. And neither my husband nor I had ever borrowed any money from the farm credit system. But after I filled out my paperwork, I thought about an investment my husband had made in an ethanol plant in Nebraska. We at that time owned some farmland in northern Kansas, and he had invested in this ethanol plant. And I asked him if he knew if it had ever borrowed any money from the farm credit system. And he said, I don't think it has, but let me look through the financial documents. And he did, and discovered that in fact they had. And so I provided that information to the ethics officer, the DAO, a designated agency ethics official. And I said, my husband actually owns some shares of stock in this company. And she said, well, he'll have to sell them. And they weren't publicly traded and therefore could not find a buyer. And she said, then he will have to gift them to a not-for-profit or to a non-dependent child who has no business relationships with him or with you. And so that's what he did. And it was about $50,000 worth of stock. And he did that so that I could continue in my career. But my husband is a military veteran. He's a fighter pilot. We believe very strongly in this democracy, and for democracy to work, you have to have ethical standards that prevent those who are in decision-making positions from using those positions to benefit themselves over the public. A third provision of the 14 principles, employees shall not engage in financial transactions using non-public government information or allow the improper use of such information to further any private interest. And then, of course, there is the Stock Act that was passed and signed into law just several years ago. Employees shall not use public office for private gain is another of those 14 principles. And this next one, which is actually principle 8, employees shall act impartially and not give preferential treatment to any private organization or individual. And that's why we can't have those meals because it's hard to be impartial when you like somebody. Employees shall endeavor to avoid any actions creating the appearance that they are violating the law or the ethical standards set forth in this part. And these, I've just gone through several of those principles, but all of them have been codified, and they are the standard. In the judicial branch for federal judges, and I'm sure many of you as lawyers know this, but there are 5 canons. The first, a judge should uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary. Number 2, a judge should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. Number 3, a judge should perform the duties of the office fairly, impartially, and diligently. Number 4, a judge may engage in extrajudicial activities that are consistent with the obligations of judicial office, and a judge should refrain from political activity. Those all make sense because judges are to be fair. And if we are going to have justice in this country, we have to have a system that is as impartial as possible. There are a number of other laws on the books, the Hatch Act, which goes back many decades, the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, which was passed by Congress and signed into law following the Nixon years, and then the Stock Act more recently. My friend, the late Louise Slaughter, was the champion of that legislation, but it simply is not in the interest of democracy for people in high office to use their access to public information or to private information that the public does not have, and use that for private gain. I genuinely believe that democracy cannot survive without an ethical citizenry or an ethical leadership. And I think that we all have to be aware if we're going to be responsible citizens. And in addition to broad policy and an understanding of broad policy, our leaders need to be committed to upholding the democratic process. And it's not enough to say, well, I don't really like the guy's ethics, but he or she, they do what I want them to do. If you want them to uphold democracy, then you have to hold them to a high ethical standard. And that concludes the formal part of my presentation.
You ready for me, Jim?
You're on mute, Jim.
Julia, do you want me to just dive in?
Go ahead, Ed, take it away.
I'm sorry, Ed. Yes, Jill, first of all, thank you. You set the tone very well for this discussion. And Ed, please proceed. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Julia, and everybody for allowing me to be back with you today. It's great to be with Mayor Perrin. I remember very fondly about 25 years ago, then Mayor Perrin taking me on a tour of Elkhart, and I just could not believe it. He literally knew everybody in every neighborhood, and people were just stopping us in the car and waving and asking questions and thanking him for different things. And it was a long time ago. Jim's hair was a lot darker, and,
Yes.
and my forehead was a lot lower back then. And it's always a pleasure to be with Dr. Long Thompson. You know, we've done these kinds of seminars many times over the last couple of years. I think that we often, when we're in person and not on Zoom, complete each other's sentences in a lot of these seminars. And I do have to say, as a disclaimer up front, that her husband, Don Thompson, has bought me lunch on more than one occasion. And Stephen and I have many friends and colleagues in common, and I'm looking forward to being able to sit down with him at some point and just kind of talk about all the people that we know together and some of our common experiences. But in the meantime here, I'll pretend that I'm back on the speaker's rostrum like I was a few years ago at one of these Common Cause seminars, and I will at least pretend to believe that it's COVID and not Speaker Houston that's preventing me from being up there today. as Jim said, that was a really great Jill Long Thompson overview on the character of democracy. And now I'm going to try and drill down a little bit more on ethics specifically. And I wasn't intending to do this, but Jill talked about the Greek meanings of some of the key words here. And that just reminded me of the word politics and people telling me that its Greek derivation is from two different words, poly meaning many and ticks meaning a parasite. So looking at the title of our session today, Making America Ethical Again, I've got to ask right up front, were we ever ethical? What do we mean by ethical? And speaking of ethical, I'm speaking personally today. I'm speaking on my behalf, not on behalf of my employer, Hannah News Service. I want to make sure that that's clear. And also indicate that if I do get a fruitcake as an honorarium, I am planning to donate that. And I assume that everybody finds my jokes to be funny in the virtual world because I can't see any kind of audience feedback. So I apologize in advance for that. Let's talk a little bit about rebuilding the public trust. And once we get past the ethics part of it, do we look at the next level, the unregulated thing that we call civility? But is even civility overrated? I mean, if you look back a couple of years, we survived Todd Rokita and Luke Messer and Mike Braun and all of those terrible TV commercials during that 2018 US Senate primary. But it's really no longer like the great Jim Shella used to put it, and it may not be politically correct today, but he used to say that this whole politics thing was a lot like the WWE. It was a bunch of white guys pretending to wrestle, but no one really gets hurt. But nevertheless, politics really is a contact sport. And I think that when you look at comparisons, we spend a lot more money than we spend on politics on negative ads for truck commercials, burger commercials, pizza commercials, cell phones, the so-called ethical drug companies, and even car insurance ads. So we shouldn't be too surprised. And I think that when you start looking at what we're talking about in the overarching sense, really the key here is the extent to which the lack of civility in the system impacts public trust and precludes consensus building. Now, we all have our preconceived notions of public sector ethics and what it entails and how we think people should be acting and how their actions should be assessed and ultimately treated. But it's really not as clear as you might think. Even if we have strong laws, people can simply break them, evade them. And even if we don't have any laws, people may have good moral compasses and act ethically. And you should realize that when I say act ethically, that doesn't mean the mere compliance with the law. And much of what we talk about when we talk about ethics isn't black and white, but rather gray. Former Indiana Supreme Court Justice Robert Rucker said that some people think of ethics as a straightforward code of conduct or spiritual command, but he adds that in the real world, he said, quote, it can be the choice between two rights or two wrongs. And Justice Rucker likes to give this talk where he goes back to a case that he dealt with when he was on the Indiana Court of Appeals before he was elevated to the Supreme Court. It involved a man who was essentially convicted of drunk driving after he took control of the car's steering wheel when the actual driver realized he was about to get stopped and jumped into the rear seat of the vehicle. So Justice Rucker, in his opinion, said, well, he was right to take control, but wrong to drive drunk. But as I told Dr. Thompson when we talked privately a week or so ago, I said there was more to it. You know, I used this example a lot in our talks, but there was more to it that I just learned a couple of months ago from the newest member of the Indiana Court of Appeals, Judge Leanna Weissman. Judge Weissman was a law clerk for Justice Rucker when Justice Rucker was on the Indiana Court of Appeals. And in her application for the Court of Appeals this year, she said that her favorite assignment as a clerk involved a case that she talked about involving the necessity defense, and that was this particular case. She said it was acknowledged in common law, but not yet codified in Indiana law when Judge Rucker came to her and said, hey, will you research this issue for this case that we're dealing with here back in 1994? And what she wrote to the Indiana Supreme Court in her application was this, and I want to quote directly. She said, defendant Toops had taken control of a car careening out of control and the driver abandoned his position at the wheel while speeding down a highway. Because Toops's license was suspended, he'd been convicted of unlawfully operating the motor vehicle by bringing the car to a safe stop. He insisted that he should have been allowed to present a defense of necessity to the jury to excuse his otherwise criminal behavior. And then she talked about how back in the day in 1994, she couldn't do research digitally, and she finally found this old case from 1842 in Pennsylvania, which involved the death of 12 men who'd survived the sinking of their ship, only to be flung from the overcrowded lifeboat into the sea to save the remaining passengers, who were mostly women and children. And she said, this case explained the use of the necessity defense, which we used in Toops, to explain how his acts were justified to save life or limb. And then she noted that Indiana has since codified the necessity defense into our statutes. Now, in case you're wondering why I went into that long-winded explanation, two reasons. One, I think it's pretty cool, and two, the CLE police may be listening, so we wanted to get in an actual case here. But in real life, Judge Rucker on the Court of Appeals reversed the conviction and let the man argue to a jury, remanding it back to the trial court, that he had acted out of necessity. So it's really not as simple all the time as right versus wrong. And even right versus right sometimes carries shades of gray. Are we talking about justice? Are we talking about mercy? Are we talking about truth versus duty? Are we talking about short-term good versus long-term good? And look for some of this to end up being debated, at least internally, by Mayor Pete as he becomes Secretary Pete at the U.S. Department of Transportation, when he has to start dealing with computer algorithms for self-driving cars. And think about it. Are you going to be, as the computer programmer, programming the car to hit a group of adults or one school-age kid? Are you going to program the car to run off a cliff to kill the occupant, or to spare a school bus that the car is about to hit? All kinds of questions that are right versus right and carry different kinds of permutations there on the colors. A lot of people, I think, that are listening in today are familiar with the Institute for Global Ethics founder, Rushworth Kidder. And he said that people who have well-defined values may agonize over choices that may simply be easy for others. He says, sound values raise tough choices, and tough choices are never easy. And he is absolutely right. Now, so much of ethics law, and certainly ethics policy, falls into that vast gray area. Those of you who are lawyers know that the difference between malum per se and malum prohibitum. Malum per se are those things that society knows are absolutely wrong, things like murder and, in our context, perhaps bribery, versus things that we say they're wrong just because we think they may be wrong, like driving over the speed limit on I-465 or not reporting the correct value for suite tickets at Bankers Life Fieldhouse or something. So what about some examples? Well, the college entrance scandal with Lori Loughlin is kind of the top of our minds today because she's about to get out of jail, and we keep reading all these articles about her and her husband, and he's trying to get out thanks to COVID. And it recalls my favorite headline of the week when all this stuff came out, and it was about another celebrity, and the headline read, "Dr. Dre boasts about daughter getting into USC all on her own, then remembers $70 million donation." And to me, that was a lot like the classic 1990 Indianapolis Star headline about the 2nd Congressional District race back then, which headlined, "Pence urges clean campaign, semicolon, calls opponent liar." Let's go after a Democrat now. Illinois Governor J.D. Pritzker. Pritzker is a billionaire. He's giving his gubernatorial staff salary supplements out of his own pocket. Is that ethical? Is that right? Does that mean that the individual who is on his staff feels a particular loyalty to him versus to the state? The state can't afford to do it. Illinois is in terrible budget shape, but is it right? What about a Republican? Victoria Spartz, the congresswoman-elect from the 5th district here in Indiana. She financed her campaign almost entirely on her own with loans from her personal largesse, but now she's eligible to be able to have some of that debt repaid by PACs, individuals, whatever, who are essentially betting on the horse that's already won. Now, I know that Stephen will probably tell you a little bit more about the question about timing of those repayments and when, for how long she can go and recharge her finances from that, and the limits on repayment overall of that debt. But there's still that out there. Mike Braun found that out after he spent almost $10 million getting himself elected a few years ago. Now, is that right? Are you better off making a better decision then by not relying on outside contributions? Or, what about if you use your own personal dollars? Should you be eligible to be repaid by those political dollars later? What should you watch here at home now in the next few weeks? Well, the first thing is that members of the Indiana Lobby Registration Commission, 3 of the 4 of them are former legislators, and 2 are Republicans and 1 is a Democrat, are reportedly very upset, as it was put, over Visa gift cards showing up on gift reports for legislators, according to the Lobby Registration Commission director, Ed Ferguson, who told this last week to the ethics section, the ethics seminar at the Denton's Legislative Conference. So perhaps there may be something in the offing on that. He said that the commissioners view the gift cards as, quote, akin to cash, but they also understand that those kinds of gifts, those gift cards, are not prohibited by law. So they're uncomfortable with it. You may want to watch something on it. Look also for changes in campaign finance law audits. I did get to see the budget that the Indiana Election Division through the Secretary of State's office presented to the State Budget Committee last week. And the FY 2022 Secretary of State's budget request for the overall campaign finance enforcement budget line for FY 2022 was $4,234. I looked over that budget request a few times to make sure that I wasn't missing any zeros. They were not there. No, it was $4,234 for the full year that they're looking at spending on campaign finance enforcement, which may be why, and I'm not sure how many of you know this, but that may be why the FBI ended up undertaking an investigation earlier this year, starting somewhere around, I think, February or April or so, that ended in the Thanksgiving week indictment of former Representative Dan Forrestal on all sorts of campaign finance charges. This has not been very widely disseminated. I've only seen one report on this, but I did read the probable cause affidavit from the FBI and the Indiana State Police, and this involved all kinds of use of campaign finance dollars spent overseas for everything from gift cards to gambling on this Costa Rican gambling website that just got busted and had to pay like $48 million to the feds to be able to stay open early. Well, actually, that just happened in September. So all sorts of stuff is still happening out there, and you're also going to hear a bunch more this week on Wednesday when the Indiana Gaming Commission meets, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. So you probably noticed that there's some tension between different kinds of applications of ethics. There's what I call the ethics club, where you use ethics as a weapon to force individuals from office or potentially portray a party as corrupt. You saw it with the Democrats against Donald Trump. Then there's the ethics edge, where you position yourself using ethics as good business or good government. And here it's basically good politics. And it's sold to legislators, it's sold to the party caucuses as on the basis of do it and it will help you in your campaigns. But even so, when you start talking about all of this, as I said, a lot of gray areas. It's hard to decide whose laws we're talking about and whose laws, whose rules should we play by. Do we use the preferences of the advanced moralists of society? The folks that some members of the legislature might say would be, oh, well, yeah, you're talking about common cause. Do you use the laws that we have right now? If so, are we talking about the laws as they're written? Or are we talking about the laws as they're enforced? Are we talking about common practice without respect to either the laws themselves or the enforcement? Are we talking about the law of nature? In other words, letting voters take care of the officials at the ballot box? Or are we talking about the law of policymakers? You know, the Ollie Norths of the world who would say, don't criminalize legitimate policymaking. Then there's the problem of the composition of the folks that actually make these laws and determine this policy. And you've got some sincere reformers, you've got some people who don't want to do anything, you've got some people who want to pay lip service to the reforms for image purposes, but don't necessarily want to do anything about it. And then there are some that just want to do something token in order to head off potentially real significant initiatives. But we'll assume that everybody's good. What's the problem then? Well, when you do things by piecemeal change, which is typically what you see in reaction to something, you end up with inconsistency in application and problems in understanding things. Ethics concepts, as you've just heard for the last 20 minutes from me and from Dr. Thompson for 25 minutes before that, are elusive and they're difficult to draft with the right specificity. And it's tough to even decide who should regulate and enforce the laws. And look back at what happened in the last 2 years here in terms of addressing the sexual harassment issues with the Attorney General. We had all kinds of different views of this issue. You know, should the Supreme Court be addressing this because he's a member of the court, a member of the bar? You know, should the voters deal with this in 2020? You know, is this a matter for the courts? Is this a civil kind of action that should decide this? All kinds of different questions. And then, you know, once you start going into the whole question about sexual harassment as the lawmakers address this and with respect to themselves, do you bring lobbyists in under that same umbrella as well? One thing that the Lobby Registration Commission's Ed Ferguson said last week at the Denton seminar was ethical behavior should be a two-way street. Legislators need to be just as ethical as lobbyists. And what about that dual system of regulation for lawyers and non-lobbyists? The Supreme Court regulates lawyers, including lawmakers and lobbyists, and you still have lawyer lawmakers that sometimes won't disclose their clients on the personal financial disclosure forms. They say that there are separation of powers concerns that cover these kinds of things, and that treating non-lawyer lobbyists differently raises equal protection issues. And the Supreme Court doesn't regulate the manicuring practice of lawyer cosmetologists. So I alluded a few minutes ago to the potential of a scandal coming up here this week or being revealed this week when the Indiana Gaming Commission meets on Wednesday. They made it real clear at their last meeting that they've got some real problems on their hands. They're going to be talking on Wednesday about what they were referring to specifically and potentially naming names. This is a scandal involving gambling in the legislature and the business world. At least 4 and perhaps 5 former legislators are involved. I'm not sure about incumbents. You're probably thinking right now, okay, well, I'll bet so-and-so and so-and-so were involved. And we all know after the fact that, you know, we suspected certain people. You know, you're going to see that list potentially on Wednesday and say, oh yeah, you know, everybody knew that this person was a problem or whatever. But let me tell you, I've dealt with over the last 30 something years, probably, I don't know, more than 400 different members of the legislature when you account for all the turnover. And the guy that just got indicted this fall, John Keeler, was probably in my list of the bottom 5 people that I would have suspected of anything. You know, he always was one of the most honorable, or seemed to be the most honorable. You never heard any scintilla of anything against him. So query where we go after that, and also question whether we have a responsibility to speak up beforehand when we do suspect something. we're running up against a deadline here, and what I just want to finish with here is that, well, there may be some bright lines that are established by law for appropriate conduct. Dr. Thompson talked about the no cup of coffee, no Diet Coke rule. You know, there's still all kinds of gray areas there. You know, under those kinds of laws, you know, can a lawmaker get assistance from a lobbyist if the lawmaker is stuck in a snowstorm on US 41 traveling home after session one night and has a flat tire? Can the lobbyist call AAA? Can the lobbyist help the lawmaker change the tire? All kinds of little things. So you've got all kinds of questions with even bright lines here. And if you've got still the whole question about whether the law really is anything more than just a moral minimum. When David Dinkins, who just passed away last week, was mayor of New York, you know, he was under investigation for something involving, I believe, playing games with his taxes. And he said, I haven't committed a crime. What I did was fail to comply with the law. Okay. So some say that ethics begins where the law ends, and that ethics is what you do when no one's watching. You know, do you personally use turn signals in an empty parking lot at 3 in.? But even if you've got prohibitions, there's still a lot of gray areas. We just talked about the AAA and no cup of coffee rule, and what is a gift more generally. Dr. Thompson and I, a couple of years ago, did an ICLEF seminar where we spent 90 minutes focused entirely on the question of gifts and bribery and what constitutes a gift. And this was before the Supreme Court decided the Mcdonald case. And, you know, we were talking about everything leading up to that and where we thought things were going. And that really did, that particular case in the US Supreme Court really did change the dynamics of things. So in the 2 minutes that I've got left here, I want to just conclude by saying, again, in the end, it basically comes down to the quality of the people that we elect to serve us. And Dr. Thompson kind of changed one of the quotes that she used to reflect reality today. And unfortunately, one of her former colleagues, former Congressman Andy Jacobs Jr., is no longer with us and can't change this. So I'll change the wording for him. But he once said, we'd all like to vote for the best man, best person, but he's never a candidate. Yeah, and just because we have strong laws doesn't mean that everyone's going to follow them. And just because we don't have strong laws, as I said up front, doesn't mean that people will not act in an ethical manner, even in the absence of laws. So, in fact, if you're looking for a quick rule of thumb, you're best advised to adopt the philosophy that Mark Twain chose in speaking to the Greenpoint Presbyterian Church in Brooklyn. He said, always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest. And for those of you who may not be convinced of the need to do right, or if you think that Twain was one of his day's more advanced moralists, let me tell you something else that he said in conclusion here. Always acknowledge a fault. This will throw those in authority off their guard and give you an opportunity to commit more. And that's what I'll leave you with today.
Ed, thank you very much. You've given us a raft of information and lots of things to think about. I think so far this webinar has been very rich, and it's going to continue to be so with our next panelist, Steve Spalding. So Steve, why don't you begin, please?
Well, thank you, Mayor, and it's a pleasure to be here with Congresswoman Thompson, Ed, and Julia. And I actually recall visiting the House of the Indiana House. I think it was back in 2012 for this annual event. Then we were looking at the influence of money in politics. 2 years after Citizens United. It's now been more than a decade after Citizens United. So it's good to be with you again, even if virtually. So, you know, and I think we can all agree that people deserve an ethical government that works for everyone. And far too often it's clear that Americans feel like they don't have a voice in their democracy, whether it's the amount of money in politics, and more specifically, not just the amount, but where it is coming from. largely a tiny, highly unrepresentative segment of the population. Lack of transparency in legislatures. I know that right now, everyone here in Washington, D.C. is waiting with bated breath to see the roughly $1 billion stimulus package and government funding bill that will be voted on later today. No one's seen a word of that text outside of some members of Congress. Many members themselves haven't yet seen it. So that lack of transparency, I think, leads to a deficit in trust in government. And then, of course, disregard for the law by some elected officials and wealthy special interests. So creating clean and ethical government that works for the people really needs to continue to be of utmost importance. For the past 4 years in particular, at least here at least with federal officials, particularly the executive branch, it's been marked by really an anything goes culture of ethics or lack thereof. And the resulting conflicts are so deep that it is hard to even know where to start. Of course, many people are likely aware of the president's refusal, for example, to release his tax returns, his refusal to divest from his businesses, and refusal to abide by basic standards that have really created a cloud over the White House and over the presidency. There's an analysis by the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington that they put out in September, which documented 3,403 of President Trump's conflicts of interest from the time he took office, again through September. And I just thought I'd share some of what CREW, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and a partner of Common Cause on a number of issues, found. They found that the president visited his businesses 503 times, with 303 of those visits made to some of his golf courses. This year in 2020 alone, he visited 7 of those properties 74 times in total, which accounts for, as of September, a third of his presidency visiting his businesses. 338 individual executive branch officials have visited Trump businesses 885 times. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his daughter, Ivanka Trump, have visited Trump businesses more than any other executive branch officials besides the president himself, 39 and 36 times, respectively. And then following them are Vice President Mike Pence, former counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, and the Secretary of the Treasury. 141 members of Congress have visited Trump's businesses, a total of 344 times. The Judiciary Chairman tops the list with 27 visits to a Trump business, followed by Senator Paul, Congressman Gates, Jordan, and McCarthy. So these 284 visits have also been made to the Trump Hotel by those officials. 145 foreign officials from 75 foreign governments have visited Trump businesses. More Turkish officials have visited them than representatives of any other country, according to CREW's analysis. 69 state officials from 34 states have visited Trump properties, including 18 governors. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida tops that list. In total, when you put together officials from Congress, the executive branch, and foreign state governments, that's 2,014 visits to Trump properties. And if you've been down to Washington over the past 4 years, you'll notice that just a few blocks from the White House sits the Trump International Hotel, which again has been a center of these visits, 973 of them, Mar-a-Lago 385. And I already mentioned many to the golf club, and I won't go into that. But what does this all mean? Well, the president has taken many opportunities to use the White House and his communications from the White House for advertising for these properties. White House officials, including the president himself, have promoted the president's businesses 426 times, often speaking from their official capacity. He himself has mentioned his businesses in speeches and interviews over the course of his presidency 338 times. And many special interest groups, partisan political groups, and foreign governments have held hundreds of events at his properties, either in Washington or abroad. 48 administration officials, including 13 cabinet members, have attended a special interest event at a Trump property and business. And political groups have hosted 88 events. Prior to coming to the presidency, his businesses were really never paid, according to an analysis of records, more than $100,000 in a single year from political groups. But since he took office in 2017, $9.7 million has been spent at his businesses, 23 million since he originally announced running for president. So though many of his best customers are his own groups and those that back his group, more than 200 Republican political groups have made a payment to one, and more than 36 of those have paid more than $10,000. And that has afforded them access to high-ranking officials. Again, given the president and vice president's frequent stops by these businesses. And as I said earlier, this includes the foreign governments and foreign government linked groups that have hosted 13 events at his hotels and resorts during the presidency, 67 officials and 20 Trump administration officials at the same time. So despite his promise that there would be a separation between the White House and the Trump organization during his administration, the president has continued to be involved with his business. He has retained the power, the decision-making power over his businesses while in office, and has, as I mentioned earlier, persistently given customers of his business access to the president himself. I mean, we used to talk for forever about wining and dining legislators, wining and dining officials, and that literally happens with, again, I just went through in maybe too painstaking detail, but with frequency. And the Trump business itself has sought to highlight how close it is to the president, not only in name, but in effect. And again, we also know that the president swore against pursuing any foreign deals while in office, but as of September, 67 trademarks from foreign governments were granted to Trump businesses. China itself granted 46 trademarks to the Trump organization. So that is a dizzying number of conflicts, and it barely scratches the surface. If we were to sum up some of the major violations that we've seen, it's been failure to disclose and divest from financial interests. There's been a failure to abide by anti-nepotism rules that apply to everyone else in government, and in his hiring of his own family members for high-level policymaking positions in the West Wing. We've seen corrupt efforts to influence law enforcement. We've seen the president repeatedly urge the Justice Department to participate in personal litigation that affects the president. And of course, abuses of the pardon power to reward personal friends, and we'll remain on high alert for that in the coming days as this administration winds up. So that tone is really set from the top, and it undermines trust in government if you look at all of the other people in the administration who have been given positions with clear conflicts of interest. For example, you can look at Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, who has at least $30 million invested in XPO Logistics, which is a postal service contractor that was paid at least $14 million since DeJoy became the Postmaster General. And then you can look at his official actions upon taking the helm of the Postal Service. He immediately began implementing new postal policies that slowed down the mail and could have had a disastrous effect on the political process, given the exponential number of Americans who would be voting by mail, given the coronavirus, so as to protect their own health and safety. There were a number of oversight hearings in the House of Representatives. He made promises to reverse and pause some of those policies during the election, but it really did look like it was heading to a disaster until oversight really ramped up over the summer, towards the end of the summer and early in the fall. So where do we go from here? It's been said that every major scandal sometimes seeds the ground for major reform. There tends to be that boom and bust cycle of scandal and then reform. If you could look back to all of the abuses in the Nixon administration and then the raft of legislation that the Watergate babies and others pursued in the 1970s and that were later updated. But there are plenty of steps that I think the Congress has been looking at and will continue to look at least at the federal level, for reforms to our ethics system. So I'll walk through, I think, a couple of major pieces of legislation that are on the docket and steps that the Congress might take. So the first is H.R. 1, which the mayor spoke briefly about in the introduction. That is comprehensive legislation with three main pillars: reducing the undue influence of money in the political process, expanding access to the ballot and voting, and the third pillar are ethics reforms to again ensure that public officials are working in the public interest. So I'll go over some of the ethics components. This legislation passed the House of Representatives last March in 2019 and did not see any action in the Senate, although we have heard the Speaker commit again to moving H.R. 1 early in the next Congress when it convenes next year, or really next month. First of all, a little bit outside the scope of my comments, but the bill would require the Supreme Court to adopt its own code of conduct, the court being the only federal court in our system that lacks a code of conduct to govern its proceedings. This was at issue in one of the Chief Justice's year-end reports a few years ago when this was a major issue, but the Congress did include in H.R. 1 a requirement that the Supreme Court adopt a code of conduct. As for the executive branch, it would require all presidential appointees to recuse themselves from any matter in which the president or the president's spouse or an entity or business of the president's has a substantial interest or as a party. It would prohibit these so-called golden parachutes, incentive payments that some corporations will give to individuals as they leave their private sector position and enter government service. And then it would specifically prohibit federal employees from awarding contracts to former employees, which in some ways may already be covered, but this bolsters those provisions of federal law. It would require a president and vice president within a month of taking office to divest financial interests that pose a conflict, or really to disclose more information about those businesses. Any waivers that are given to executive branch employees would need to be disclosed and posted publicly to the Office of Government Ethics. That's really been inconsistent during the Trump administration and some earlier administrations. The bill would require any individuals nominated or appointed to Senate confirmed positions to disclose any political contributions by or solicited by or made on behalf of an individual. And I'm just ticking through some of the major pieces of this 706-page bill. It would require presidents-elect to develop ethics plans that apply to members of the transition, which has largely been sort of a no man's land when it comes to certain ethics rules. So that would require these ethics plans to be made publicly available. And then finally, of course, it would require the disclosure of individual and certain business tax returns by the president and vice president. There's many other bills pending that have been introduced. That's one of the big marquee bills. There have been some other more targeted bills that moved through the House, and I would expect we'll probably have action in the next Congress as well. One is the executive branch, the Comprehensive Ethics Enforcement Act, which would zero in and reform the Office of Government Ethics, or OGE, which is the agency tasked with identifying and helping to resolve violations of ethics laws and regulations. But the House, the House of Representatives, in reviewing the agency, the Oversight Committee is the Committee on Oversight and Reform, found that it, quote, lacks sufficient authority to investigate and compel compliance, which is true. And those that have been watching this agency for a long time know that it is in large part an advisory agency and really lacks the teeth to enforce federal ethics laws. One of the witnesses at a hearing on that bill last year explained that, quote, we can no longer assume that presidents will follow the norms and practices of their predecessors. Presidents may simply not show the same commitment to ethics rules as we have come to expect, and as we have seen, past erosion will lead to future abuse. We need a broader set of reforms to ensure our leaders remain committed to using their powers to advance the people's interests. That begins with enshrining transparency requirements and laws so that the public can identify improper influences, providing a mechanism for ensuring accountability when abuse occurs, and eliminating avenues for personnel to handle matters involving their personal or financial interests, end quote. The former director of the Office of Government Ethics, Walter Schaub, testified how OGE can, quote, ask agencies to conduct investigations and request copies of records, but has no power to do anything if they ignore these requests. So this legislation would authorize OGE to issue subpoenas and enforce those subpoenas in federal court. That's generally the same authority that inspectors general have, but with subpoena power, OGE really could compel compliance. This bill also makes crystal clear that all officers or employees serving in the executive branch, including White House personnel and employees of the Executive Office of the President, are subject to the Ethics in Government Act, which is the watershed legislation that establishes these ethics requirements in the first place. And this is important after the Trump administration essentially took the position that many of its employees, a novel position that many of its employees are somehow exempt from the law. And then finally, the bill would allow the Office of Government Ethics to issue administrative penalties for violations of the Ethics in Government Act. Together with subpoenas, this would give OGE, we think, the tools it needs to investigate ethics violations. But even with this legislation, we believe there are steps that a presidential administration, including the incoming administration, could take via executive order to, again, elevate a culture of ethics. And so here are some of the reforms that we think the president could take himself when he takes office, President-elect Biden, in January, that we've put forward for the administration to consider, along with a number of other allies all across the country. One, we think that the incoming president could establish, in keeping with his predecessor, President Obama, establish a meaningful ethics pledge applicable to all incoming appointees. We hope that the incoming administration will craft a pledge that accounts for the revolving door, requires all appointees to sign it, disclose those pledges once they're signed, and then if there is a waiver, to disclose the waiver. The Obama administration's pledge included a gift ban, a blanket gift ban from lobbyists, a 2-year ban on working on particular issues, not just matters, but particular issues involving a former employee, and a ban on lobbying the administration after leaving government. And that was core to the Obama pledge. I should also mention that HR 1 would codify this pledge, but if that doesn't happen, if that does not become law anytime soon, then this is something that we think the Biden administration could take on their own. We would urge the administration to extend anti-nepotism principles to White House and administration hiring. That could happen if the incoming administration directs the Office of Legal Counsel at DOJ to re-examine its anti-nepotism analysis when it comes to White House hiring. But the president could just take this, could also just take this pledge on his own. We also think that the incoming administration should commit to releasing a public explanation if the president decides not to follow any guidance or recommendations from the Office of Special Counsel in the case of Hatch Act violations. involving White House aides, which we've seen particularly over the past year and over the summer when President Trump decided to host the Republican National Convention on the lawn of the White House and use White House property. We've seen a number of White House aides flagrantly violate the Hatch Act. They were reprimanded by the Office of Special Counsel, but it's really left up to the president to do anything about it. This executive action would require the president to release a public explanation, again, if they decide not to follow their office's recommendations. It would be terrific if we could have the president urge all designated agency ethics officials. Those are the ethics officials that are in all of the federal agencies. There's about 4,000 of these ethics officials to follow recommendations of OGE. And we urge them to, again, at a minimum, release any public explanation to the extent they're able to when they do not decide to go forward with OGE's recommendations. Prohibiting financial interests. We urge the incoming president to commit to requiring any member of the Biden-Harris administration who's a beneficiary of a discretionary trust to disclose those trusts' holdings. And again, this has come up several times about tax returns, but it should not take, necessarily an act of Congress, although we know this is a norm that's been violated and needs to be closed. But the president and the vice president should commit, we think, to disclosing their tax returns on an annual basis, something that the president has failed to do. When it comes to the golden parachute prong of the legislation that I mentioned earlier, for those leaving the private sector and entering government, this is something that an incoming administration could issue as a blanket prohibition on accepting compensation from a former employer or client specifically awarded for their government service. And then finally, as I wrap up, there's just the bully pulpit and the convening power that comes with 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And we hope that the incoming president would hold an annual kind of cabinet level meeting on ethics and ethics reform and invite high level officials and select designated agency ethics officials to advise on their agency's work administering and implementing these requirements and making public commitments for their work. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to join, and I'll turn it back over to the mayor.
Steve, that was great. I think, again, this has been a very rich webinar, lots and lots of information, lots of things to think about. We're a little bit early, but we've got 7 questions I see here. So why don't we just go ahead with those? The first question is from Patrice Wadner, and she says, she asks, who oversees the legislators and executive branch ethics according to the stated standards? Seems these have been overlooked recently. I don't know who wants to take that. Steve, are you able to do that?
Sure, I can talk at least at the federal level. So again, you have OGE, which is in large part, it exists in an advisory capacity, helps vet incoming nominees when it comes to their conflicts, provides advice to the 4,000 agency ethics officials that I mentioned. But really, when it comes to any sort of enforcement with teeth, that would be left to the public integrity section of the Department of Justice. But otherwise, there has not been sort of a centralized focus when it comes to federal ethics enforcement. When it comes to, I think there was a question about legislators, at least in Congress. So that would be left up to the ethics committees in the House and then the Senate. One interesting check in the House is after, gosh, it must have been, I don't even want to, 2007, 2008, the House passed legislation through its rules establishing an Office of Congressional Ethics, which is kind of a watchdog of the Ethics Committee and kind of makes public, does an initial kind of investigation and then punts it to the Ethics Committee with a recommendation so that there's a little bit of accountability on the ethics process. But that, again, is largely left to each legislative house of Congress to follow its own ethics rules. I don't know if any other panelists wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Julia,
go ahead, Ed.
Please. Yeah, Julia, I'm not sure if the the participants have a copy of that Indiana Law Review article that I wrote too many years ago about legislative ethics? They do? Okay, well, you can get a good overview in that. And unfortunately, as Julia reminded me last week when we talked, not a whole lot has changed. Basically, nothing has changed since I wrote that, I think close to, well, more than 10 years ago, maybe 12 or so years ago. But the legislative ethics committees in the respective chambers are the folks that kind of offer advice and counsel to legislators. In the next session, they just changed chairs. I believe that Senator Greg Walker just moved from the, Julia's nodding yes, from the Committee on Elections to Ethics. And then in the House, Representative Tony Cook moved from, I think, Vice Chair of the Education Committee to chair of the Ethics Committee. And I heard him talk about it in a radio interview last week with a radio station in Marion, where he was saying, you know, he's looking forward to that and being able to provide advice and counsel to his colleagues. But, you know, in practice, a lot of that comes from the speaker or the speaker's counsel talking to individual members and saying, you know, this doesn't look good, or yeah, don't worry about taking that to the committee. You're okay. Don't even bother. But it's not as formal a kind of process as one might think. At the executive branch level, there's the State Ethics Commission and the Office of the Inspector General. That process was, in my mind, again, speaking personally, not on behalf of my employer or anybody else, unduly complicated back in 2005 when Governor Daniels set up the Office of the Inspector General. And I still have a tough time trying to explain to people, even trying to understand myself, you know, exactly what the difference between OIG and the State Ethics Commission is, and when OIG gets involved and brings something to the State Ethics Commission and how that all works. But there's a really good group of people on the Ethics Commission right now. And in fact, when I started covering the legislature back in the dark ages, Pat Traub, who is the political writer for the Star, told me two things you never miss. You never miss a Rules Committee meeting in the Senate, and you never miss a State Ethics Commission meeting. And I've kind of taken that to heart, although I wish I could make more of those meetings. But just last week before, the Ethics Commission met, and they actually turned down a request for a conflict of interest waiver on behalf of somebody involved in the EMS Commission. And, you know, it was a pretty straightforward, and I'm not sure if one of the commission members actually used the word brazen, but it was a very surprising request. You know, one that seemed to be on its face a real conflict of interest. And the commission members really hit this guy hard with all kinds of questions, and ultimately voted unanimously against giving him the waiver that he had sought. So sometimes the system does work.
Okay, thanks for that. Julia, go ahead.
And if I would just jump in just to make things more complicated, there are a couple of other regulatory agencies that are involved at the state level. It's the Indiana Lobbying Registration Commission, which oversees lobbyists. And, you know, our law here is pretty much based on disclosure. So it doesn't really tell lobbyists how they're supposed to act, but basically what sort of money, what expenditures are you making? And of course, we have no limits here in Indiana on the amount of gifts that can be bought and gifted to legislators. So I was interested to hear Ed's remarks earlier about potential scandals on the horizon on the campaign finance side. And he mentioned the very cursory regulation that we have of campaign finance here in Indiana. And that is done through the Indiana Election Division underneath the Indiana Election Commission. So from our perspective, one of the challenges we have with the regulation of ethics here in Indiana is you just have too many different bodies. Now, we recognize that, you know, there's a difference between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and that you have to have a different regulatory process in place. But you know, we've been urging, and here in Indiana, we have gotten tiny episodic bits of reform after we've had various scandals. And we've always come to the table with the idea that, you know, particularly when it comes to the legislature, having an internal ethics process makes it very difficult, both for the public and the legislators themselves that are charged with upholding the ethics rules. We feel it would be much better to emulate our neighbor to the south, Kentucky, which after a very significant ethics scandal in that state back in the 80s, they really passed a comprehensive set of reform that I think the centerpiece is this Citizens Ethics Commission, which oversees the process down in that state. From my perspective, one of the problems we have is you have this bifurcated authority in terms of ethics enforcement in Indiana, and it can be very difficult, I think, even for the regulators to know who's in charge here.
Following up on what Julia just said, from 83 to 87, I was the staff director for the Council on Governmental Ethics Laws, which is the campaign finance, ethics, and lobby law administrators around North America, including Canada. And one of the big debates that we had over those years was whether it was more effective to have an individual state ethics or provincial ethics commission, a separate campaign finance governing body, and a separate lobbying commission, or whether it was better to have a super commission. And nobody really came to the best conclusion on that. There really was a move in the late 80s to kind of consolidate those under a public disclosure commission umbrella, where they also had an authority for freedom of information requests and opinions and enforcement as well. But some of the states ended up going back to the individual commissions as well. And Julia mentioned the Kentucky commission, and one of the reasons, the big reason that was set up was because of a problem that they had back in the early 90s with respect to a big scandal that involved horse racing and the legislature. And the guy that was the highest visible target in that was the then speaker, guy by the name of Don Blanford, who was a Kroger butcher for many years. And people started to wonder, well, wait a minute, why is this guy driving new Corvettes each year? And turned out, he was highly involved in this scandal. It was called Bob Trot because it centered around the Business Organization and Professions Committee in the General Assembly, Kentucky General Assembly, and also involved the horse racing community. So, back then, everybody afterwards, oh yeah, we all knew, Blanford was a problem, but well, why didn't anybody say anything, when everybody knew about it? It was an open, not even a secret, but it was an open matter of discussion there.
Okay, thanks for all that. The next question is from Doug Gallagher, and he is asking, what teeth is there for enforcing the ethical guidelines for the executive branch and legislative branch?
I mentioned, and it depends on the infraction, obviously, but the 14 principles in the executive branch have been codified, and so it would depend upon how serious the breach is, but there can be obviously criminal prosecution. Stephen can probably, I'm a PhD, I'm not a lawyer. So Stephen and Ed can answer these questions better than I can, but criminal prosecution is an option if it has been codified in criminal code. But I want to make another point, and that's that the president and vice president are exempt. For example, 18 USC section 208, I think it is. They're both exempt from that. Am I right, Stephen and Ed? Yeah.
Yeah, it is right. And at least on 208, it's my understanding that, and this has come up over the past 4 years, that while the president, given the position the president plays in the government, overseeing everything, that makes it difficult, to fully apply per se, the way it does other government officials. It's been the case that the president has always nonetheless followed it as if it applied, or at least that's been the standard that's been abandoned during this president's administration.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Sharon Murphy, and she is asking, what is the Mcdonald's case? I think that was.
Yeah, it's actually Mcdonald, capital M, small c, capital D, Onnell. And he was the former governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he had been involved in a really messy situation where a guy who wasn't really a friend, but was a political benefactor of sorts, came to him and said, "Hey, look, I really want to get the University of Virginia system involved in helping me out on this great tobacco-related product that I've got, where we can kind of get away from the reliance on smoking, but keep the Virginia tobacco industry growing in more ways than one." And he started giving all kinds of gifts and other kinds of benefits to the governor and his family. The list is absolutely ridiculous. When we're talking about Rolex watches, I mean, that was one of the smaller kinds of things. And, the guy paid for the governor's daughter's wedding, and it was just amazing. And the question was, is the governor really accepting a gift on behalf of or from this guy on behalf of doing something for him that involves the theft of honest services of government under Section 1983? And the Supreme Court, trying to remember if it was unanimous. If it wasn't, it was just one dissenting vote. Said, "Hey, look, this doesn't rise to that level here, and this isn't quite what some people might think. This guy, the governor, was essentially just kind of providing the normal services of government here. He was just like setting up some meetings on behalf of a constituent, and to a certain extent, the gifts and everything are immaterial. That's a real quick characterization of the case, and you really ought to take a good look at it. But afterwards, just like in 1987, when the Supreme Court came in with the McNally case and said, "Hey, all these prosecutions under that honest theft of services clause that that then U.S. Attorney Jim Thompson in Illinois started back in the late 1970s, these things are not going to stand." And a lot of people were sprung, including three gentlemen here in Indiana who were convicted of property tax related fraud. One of them was a lobbyist and joked afterwards, "Hey, now I'm the only certified innocent lobbyist in the hallways." But the Congress went back and looked at things, and now I think you're seeing the courts take a look at this in a little bit different a light. So McDonald v. United States, or US v. McDonald.
Okay, thanks, Ed, for that clarification. An anonymous attendee is asking, what is the group that published the list of conflict visits to Trump properties in the date or site of that study?
Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington did that really deep dive, and I can tell you your website is, if you go to citizensforethics.org, you will find it on their website.
Okay, thank you.
And let me add, CREW is nonpartisan, and they have leadership that comes from both Democrats and Republicans. They're very, very credible.
Very good. Very good. Thank you both. Doug Gallagher again is asking, has there been any indication that the incoming Congress or administration will put more teeth in the ethical rules for new administrations?
In summary, there is indication that that will happen, certainly on the House side. I think it will depend upon the outcome of the election in Georgia, whether it happens on the Senate side. And I would refer back to H.R. 1, which, as I recall, only passed the House and not the Senate. Is that correct, Stephen?
Yes, that is correct. And the speaker said that she will put H.R. 1 on the floor early in the new Congress. I do expect there will be some tweaks to that legislation, but it will be, we anticipate that it is going to be voted on again in the 117th Congress when it convenes. But like I mentioned earlier, there's, I think, a number of other bills as well. I mean, that's the big comprehensive legislation, but specifically legislation to further refine OGE. And then I think some other interesting legislation that will be coming down the pike. One is called the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which takes a look at the Emoluments Clause and how that's been enforced, that takes a look at bolstering the wall between the Department of Justice and the White House when it comes to investigations and prohibiting political interference, when it comes to enforcing oversight subpoenas by Congress. So that legislation is all legislation that I think will make its way down the pike. And to the earlier point, on partisanship, I think, a lot of this legislation in the past has passed on a bipartisan basis. And, I certainly hope that some of that will return in the new Congress and with new leadership, that we can begin to see some more bipartisan action. And if the big kahuna doesn't pass, then maybe we can find agreement on some of the other pieces as it moves through. One thing that I would note, just again on the ethics, on the congressional piece, is that the Office of Congressional Ethics, which, as I mentioned earlier, kind of serves as a check on the Ethics Committee and as a watchdog on the Ethics Committee, that passed by House rule. That's not a statutory office. And so every 2 years, we have to examine the House rules to see that the OCE is, that its doors not only just stay open, but that its doors exist. A few years ago, there was an effort to shut down the OCE. It is not that popular with some members. And there was an effort to kind of just scrap it by doing it by kind of taking its teeth out in the rules process, and in a way that can be done kind of quietly. But a number of nonpartisan watchdog organizations spoke out, and it remains open today, but does not exist in the Senate. Its jurisdiction is only in the House.
Thank you both. This next question is from Nancy Cohn, and it's for Stephen Spalding. And she says, excellent information, but how do we publicize your findings? More about DeJoy. Does Biden get to appoint his successor? Or is the Board of Governors in charge of that?
So on the latter point, yes, it is the Board of Governors that makes that decision. And incidentally, there's 9 members of the Board of Governors. I think that the Trump administration just nominated a commissioner who would solidify a 5-4 Republican Board of Governors. So I think it's no more than 5 can be from one political party, but there will be 5 Republican affiliated members of the Board of Governors. So DeJoy could be with us for a while into the next administration. There will be a couple of other vacancies on the board, but I don't think the next vacancy to flip the makeup of the board would be until late into next year. So he may stay. Who knows? He may get fed up and want to leave, but that's a decision for the board to make.
I have a follow-up question that I think Stephen might be able to answer. Even if the term runs longer, sometimes there is a provision in the law, depending upon the appointment, that a person can be removed for cause. And so if it were determined that he was engaging in a conflict of interest that is not legal, I would be surprised if it weren't possible to have him removed for cause. But I may be wrong on the postal service. I know at Farm Credit, even though the terms run longer than their 6-year terms, you can be removed if you have violated a law. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yep. And yes, it is. Members of the board can also be removed for cause as well, although there's been some anonymously sourced reporting that unclear if the incoming administration is going to lean on that. I guess we don't know, but yes, that provision of the law does exist, that they could be removed for cause. Okay.
And also, the postmaster can be held accountable for a conflict of interest. And I'm thinking back to the 1990s when I'm doing this from memory, but the Postmaster General approved a contract that included soft drink machines in which he held a financial interest, the company that would be installing those machines. And I think he had to pay a settlement as a result of that. But I'm doing this from memory, but there was some kind of requirement on his part after he was in violation.
Appreciate that. Mary Ann Williams, again, is inquiring, should President Trump be investigated by special counsel for federal ethics violations after he leaves office in an effort to restore accountability? Anybody want to take that?
It gets tricky, and because I'm, again, not a lawyer, I want to be careful, but there are potential ways that a president can be held responsible after leaving office for criminal activity that occurred in office. And Stephen and Ed, you can probably fill that in to a greater degree, but there are courses of action that can be taken, unless somebody were to be pardoned, of course.
Yeah, I would say I do think there's going to be both a serious effort at a look back at many of the conflicts, and whether that's personal accountability for the then former president, or whether it is looking at places to shore up laws that or norms that were never codified but need to be codified. I think there will be a comprehensive effort to look at ways to tighten up the law, hold people accountable for violating those laws. I do think we'll see both kind of a forward-looking approach, but also one that is grounded in what we've seen over the course of the administration. I will point out that the one other piece of legislation I mentioned earlier, the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which is a comprehensive kind of rule of law bill that was written by 7 different committee chairs, and we expect will move forward at least next year, we hope, does include a provision that tolls the statute of limitations for any violations by a sitting president. And so we know there's this long-standing OLC Department of Justice opinion that a sitting president, might not be able to be indicted and tried while they're in office. This legislation would toll that statute for a president.
Okay, thank you. Doug Gallagher comes to us again and he's asking, can the speakers give some of their thoughts on the upsides and downsides of making the 14 general principles of ethical conduct for the executive branch apply to the president and vice president?
The downside is that because they've been codified and the president is, the Department of Justice is not an independent agency, that it makes it very difficult for there to be enforcement. While it is perfectly appropriate for a president to direct the Department of Justice into certain types of investigations, for example, thinking back to John Kennedy, who went after organized crime, it is completely inappropriate for a president to intervene in an individual case. But I don't think there's anything that can actually prevent that from happening. I mean, obviously the way presidents are prosecuted is through the impeachment process. And I think we have to be very careful about going after sitting presidents. It's just that we have never seen, at least in my lifetime, anything like what we've witnessed with the sitting president. And there are not always simple, straightforward answers to solving these problems, but clearly we need to address these issues in ways different from how we are addressing them now, because it is undermining democracy. Serving as president should not exempt you from being prosecuted for criminal activity. Now, having said that, I'm not sure how I don't know if you set up a separate body it would potentially require a constitutional amendment. So we're talking about something that could be quite complex and quite difficult is my thinking. But my colleagues on the panel might have a simpler, more easily applied proposal or answer.
Any thoughts?
I associate myself with your comments, Congresswoman.
Right. Thank you both for that. And the next question is from Linda Hansen, and she is asking, which Indiana Legislative Committee would observe and challenge the small amount of funding in the proposed budget for oversight of ethical behavior? And she goes on to say, could there be repercussions for repeated reliance on the FBI when we don't adequately fund that budget line?
Well, that would generally be the Committee on Ways and Means. They're the ones kind of responsible for the overarching things. The substantive committees, like the elections committees, don't have a whole lot of authority and don't take a lot of interest in the budgets on those things. So it's really Ways and Means on the House side and appropriations on the Senate side. But we're dealing with a really tough budget year again this year, and the numbers were actually up a little bit from FY21 and 20 and 21. So they can say that this represents an increase.
Okay. Any other comments? I think that wraps up our questions. I don't know that we have any others at this point. So, but Julia, please.
Yeah, I'm going to exercise my ability to mute myself and
absolutely
answer the question we didn't get into. I'm really interested to hear the panelists' take on the ethics of redistricting. That's going to be next to the Indiana budget, the big legislative issue in 2021. We will again have a process here in Indiana that's dominated by one party. And so, we believe that causes problems in terms of accountability, in terms of people feeling they can make their voices heard, which results in low turnout, which has plagued us here in Indiana over the past decade. So, what are the ethics of partisan gerrymandering, and how can we message that so that the current majority that will lead that process in Indiana is reminded that, yes, they've won the election. Yes, they control the Indiana State House, but these are the people's districts, and therefore, more than one party should have a say in what they turn out to be.
Well, as you know, research from Brookings has shown that in the federal legislature, in the Congress, that there have been seats bonuses in the last several years, primarily for Republicans, but there have been times in the past when gerrymandering has resulted in a seats bonus or pretty significant seats bonus for the Democratic Party as well. This is an ethics issue, and it does undermine democracy because you're not providing for the same fair representation and participation, equality of opportunity to participate when you have these extremely gerrymandered districts. It's a macro ethics issue that has micro consequences. Microethics refer to basically dotting your I's and crossing your T's, which we don't do anymore since we do word processing instead of cursive writing. But following the rules of whatever profession you're in. Macroethics refer to the long-term and broad consequences of what you're doing. So you can be dotting your I's and crossing your T's, but if you're putting in place policy, and here we're talking about policy regarding representation of populations, and when you have gerrymandered districts, then you end up with entire segments of the population that are basically not represented in a representative democracy. And so this is an ethics issue, and we need to, and I think the federal government needs to address this, and congressional lines should not be drawn by partisans. It should be independent drawing of lines, and Common Cause is just doing, I think, a great service to the country in informing the public, and just the tireless efforts and the strategic efforts of Common Cause, I think, are very important to protecting our democracy here. But it needs to be addressed at both the federal and the state level.
Exactly. We do have another question that came in from one of our attendees. Sharon Murphy wants to know did the Citizens for Ethics group quantify the taxpayer funds expended by the president by bringing his staff and Secret Service members whenever he goes to a property?
I'm not sure if they have. They may have. If you poke around, there have been a number of reports on that, and on the expenditures by the Secret Service. There have been a number of statements made about what they were specifically charged, what they weren't charged, but they do have some of that analysis, I believe, on their website. Just to piggyback on the earlier question on redistricting, fully agree with Congresswoman Thompson's comments, and also just want to kind of underscore the need for transparency into the redistricting process to ensure that it's successful. Ideally, those meetings would be open and they would be accessible to the public. There have been a number of principles that I'll link to that we can share around redistricting that have been endorsed by a huge swath of organizations in the civil rights community that are really geared towards building public trust in the redistricting process, and in ensuring that it is fully accountable and fully representative. So I'll share those materials as well.
In real life, it's going to be an interesting process in 2021, both because the data is going to be coming out a little bit later, apparently, and also because of the numbers themselves. And I think a lot of this is kind of going to be self-limiting, regardless of who's in charge of the process or what standards outside of the case law standards that they're required to follow will be. You've got a difference in the population between Indiana of the 1816s and the 2016s. You even have a big change between, since the beginning of this decade. And we're seeing, population essentially flee the cities, move into the suburbs, and we're seeing a decline in population in the rural areas of the state. So it's going to be a little bit more difficult. For example, if you were to ask the ranking minority members of the election committee in the Senate and the House to draw their maps themselves so as to best advantage all the Democrats, I don't think that you'd be picking up more than a handful of seats under the case law standards that they have to follow. It's going to be very difficult for Democrats, period. And then I think that you also have to look at the reality that Speaker Houston is going to have to face. And I think that he probably would have been a little bit happier if there had been a few fewer seats, at least for redistricting purposes, a few fewer Republicans winning some of those seats in November, because you really cannot draw a whole lot more safer Republican districts in the state than you've got right now. And a lot of these districts that were won by Republicans, that continue to be won by Republicans, are essentially marginal districts or districts that have changed from Democrat, like all along the Ohio River, from Lawrenceburg all the way to Mount Vernon over the years, and are probably not ready to change back simply because of the demographics and the changing political philosophy in the state. So you think about those things and you realize that there's not a whole lot more that the Republicans are going to be able to do to make some of those districts safer. And the one thing that anybody who served in the General Assembly knows is that the Speaker and the person who the Speaker puts in charge of the redistricting process for the majority are just besieged by requests from legislators anytime they hear about another family from X political persuasion moving into the X ward of the X precinct. They want the lines drawn so they get to push them back out into somebody else's district. It's all self-preservation. And it's going to be very difficult to draw these lines so that people can remain safe. At the same time, I think that you're going to see a movement on the part of some of the leadership Republicans to put a couple of their more problematic members, and problematic in terms of their relationships with leadership, in districts where they might be together. Since Christy Stutzman left, I can use this example, but you could potentially have seen a district where Christy Stutzman and Kurt Nicely were put in together, so that both of them would not be able to survive a primary, for example. So you're going to see a lot of creative map making that will be outside of just the whole question of partisan gerrymandering, and a lot of that's going to be driven by the actual data and by the law.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple more questions, but we're bumping up on the hour. I don't know if we have time to answer them, but I'll read the questions anyway and see what we can do. Angela Adams asks, can you talk about how we get past the poisonous partisanship? Neither party believes the other party's facts. Media outlets are skewed, sources are ignored and discarded based on the messenger's partisan affiliation. How do we get beyond this and unite behind what is ethical and right, politics aside, or is that impossible?
I'm going to say that the way that we draw district lines, the gerrymandering, I think that contributes to the bipartisanship, because you end up with people who are on the extreme left or the extreme right in positions of power, and it discourages the election of moderates who are bipartisan, basically. So I think that's one of the issues. The other issue here is we really need to improve on information literacy, and that needs to be done K through 12 in college. If you're getting your information off of Facebook, really, you're not informed. And I think that we also need to make it clear that and there are great websites now that provide this information, but we haven't done a good job of broadly educating the public on information credibility. And we have a lot of work to do, but if we change the way we draw district lines, that will help. Information literacy will help. And beyond that, I think this is just, to some degree, a part of being in a democracy where you have people who disagree. But we want to do a better job of electing to office people who understand that the middle ground is important, because we all have to get along for democracy to work.
Well, let me follow up just by asking a question of Dr. Thompson. When you were in Congress, were you able to kind of forge friendships over partisan lines? Were you able to make friends with anybody across the aisle?
Of course, it was different then. A lot changed in the 1990s, and I actually hold former Congressman Newt Gingrich, former Speaker Gingrich, responsible for some of it. And as you know, his party was really pushing the gerrymandering in the state legislatures at that time. But just the tone of his leadership was very negative. And again, you were talking about civility. There's some great research on civility done by Christine Porath from Georgetown University. And she's in fact published, in addition to scholarly works, has published a book. And civility matters, and in terms of effectiveness. And people who are civil are even perceived as more successful than people who aren't civil. But we need to rebuild these as values in this country. And I think a lot of these things are intertwined, but each of us has a responsibility in this democracy to work to advance civility, cooperation, agreement, and really we need to move away from this just hateful, hate-spewed language and mischaracterization.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up at this point. We're at the 2-hour limit. There's one more question, but we can't get to it now, but it's an interesting one. And I know the attendee, and I'll reach out to you because it's something we've been talking about at Common Cause. I wish I could share it, but anyway, more later on that. Thank you, panelists. This has been a very rich and lively discussion. Just fantastic in my view. I'm going to turn it back to Julia for some wrap up and housekeeping issues. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Jim. You did a great job moderating, and to the panelists, thank you. You guys really gave us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate the great questions and the discussion we were able to have today. And I think more than anything else, we've got to elevate the issue of ethics to the top of our agenda, both at the national and state level. And as citizens just demand more ethical behavior, stronger ethics laws at all levels. So thanks for helping us have this discussion. Again, to the attorneys, you can leave your name and your attorney number in the chat box, and we will be making a screenshot of that, and I will use that information to get to the CLE Commission to ensure that all of you get the credits that you are entitled to today. If you have any questions, I'm going to leave you my email address in the chat box in case you have any questions. I do want to give just a quick plug. As I mentioned, our big legislative focus this year is going to be redistricting. The maps will be drawn in 2021, and we've got some exciting projects planned to hopefully make the process here in Indiana more transparent and more open and inviting of public participation. One of the centerpieces of that is the Indiana Citizens Redistricting Commission, which will be a shadow commission, modeling what the process should be like for both voters and legislators in our state. You can find out more about that at the Common Cause website or at our coalition, allinfordemocracy.org. But many of you would be great candidates to serve on this Citizens Commission. So if you haven't had the opportunity to find out more about it, I hope again you'll go to allinfordemocracy.org or the Common Cause website, where we have the rules and the application for a place on that commission. I think that's the only way we have, absent of passing legislation, to really make the process one that works better for citizens. So it only will be successful, though, if we have a lot of public participation. So again, I hope you'll take the opportunity to check that out. Thanks again for everybody who was able to join us online for this event. Really enjoyed it, and we appreciate your ongoing support. So happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for being with us. I hope you have a great week and a great holiday. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Good job, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will be sending out a recording of this to everybody, so we'll be passing that along to you as well.
Okay, Julia, what do you want me to do for reporting my CLA? Do you want me to just send you my bar number separately in an email? Okay, cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
just send it to me in an email. I'll get it in the letter.
Okay, and you got the address for the fruitcake, right?
Or you want a doorstop instead?
Same thing.
Yeah. Everybody have a good holiday.
You
Thank
too.
very
Merry
much.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas to
too.
everybody. Take
Be
care.
safe. Take care.
Yeah, be
Thank
healthy.
you, Becky,
Yeah.
for all your help.
Thanks.
Good work,
Bye now.
everyone. See you.